doing? How are folks doing? How you doing? All right. We are here for the final conversation to talk about thinking big in California. And I have two Californians with me who have cut a national profile through their bold thinking, their bold policymaking, and their excellent use of social media. I am honored to be here with Congressman Khanna, the second-term congressman from Silicon Valley, whose district represents Google, Apple, Tesla, among hundreds of other tech companies, and whose voice has been bold from the beginning on internet freedom to modern antitrust since taking office. And with me, Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton, California, one of the youngest mayors in America. Elected as a city council member at 22 years old, he's helped lead the city of Stockton out of bankruptcy and toward reinvention, including his cutting-edge pilots on violence prevention and a guaranteed income. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
So I want to start off the conversation by laying out Dr. Manuel Pastor's argument that it's not just today's big thinking that's noteworthy in California, or that we're some sort of political outlier, but rather our history, our journey over the last several decades is in fact a bellwether for the nation. He says that, several decades ago, California was mired in xenophobia, job decline, and anti-tax sentiment. During this period, we elected our own movie star governor, Ronald Reagan. Rush Limbaugh started his career in Sacramento as a little-known radio guy spewing hate. And California then looked a lot like America today. To quote Dr. Pastor, he says, "The current storm of demographic anxiety, economic uncertainty, and profiteering off political polarization, we did that first in California." But as he says, we've pulled out of that period thanks to a demographic shift, progressive organizing, and progressive policymaking to become a much more pluralistic state that reflects our younger, more diverse demographics. And so we know that we have a lot of work to do in California on inequality and housing, but we are also now the 5th largest economy in the world, and we've passed some of the most progressive policies. So I find this to be a really hopeful story for where the nation could head. And Congressman, I think you're actually one of the best suited in the nation to talk about this question of whether or not California is an outlier or a bellwether, since you spend time in both DC and California. So do you think we have a blueprint here for the nation?
Well, Natalie, first, thank you for having me. We're honored to be on the panel with you. Thanks for staying for our last panel. I know it's been a long day. Great speakers, though. Several points. First, I used to wince every time Ted Cruz, when you would watch those debates with Beto O'Rourke, and he'd say people are fleeing and leaving California. And I just wish someone had some basic facts. I mean, we are $2.7 trillion of the GDP, 15% of this country's GDP. I don't think there's a single American that would wish that Apple or Google or Intel or Facebook or Yahoo weren't American companies. Imagine what our innovative potential would be if those companies were in China or India or Brazil. So California has had the largest economic growth of states. So we have extraordinary innovation. We have an extraordinary contribution to make. I think, though, we need to have a sense of humility also to understand that Californians, most of us, are from all over the country and all over the world. And what drives California's success is, I think, the values that drive America's success. It is a commitment to education, investment in research, investment in science and technology. And our challenge, in my view, is how do we make the knowledge economy more inclusive? How do we democratize access to the knowledge economy? If you give me 30 more seconds, right now a lot of the focus of policy is redistributive post-production. In other words, the wealth creation is for a select few in a select few geographies, and then we say, okay, how do we tax that? And I'm for higher taxes, and how do we distribute it? But that's not going to actually create economic opportunity or solve the huge disparities in wealth. What we need to do is think about how we democratize access to wealth creation and the knowledge economy and production. And that is a very long conversation that I think California, and particularly Silicon Valley, need to do a much better job at.
Before we move on, will you give us a few examples of where you think policymaking should head to do that democratization?
Well, I think, for one, we need to look at where talent is. We need to, when it comes to communities of color, have much more partnerships with HBCUs and other institutions, so we have real pipelines for people becoming into tech and becoming entrepreneurs and getting funded. We need to pay far more attention to rural America. I mean, we have outsourced 190,000 tech jobs. Those jobs are not sophisticated. Those aren't the people creating the next prototype of the Apple iPhone. Those jobs that have been outsourced could be done anywhere in America. But why didn't we do it in small towns? I mean, the dream of technology was that people didn't have to move, that you could actually live and have some independence and still have work. Why is it that we aren't making those kind of investments across this country so that people can stay in the communities where they grew up in? As I've traveled to Appalachia and Beckley, West Virginia, and Jefferson, Iowa, and places, one of the things that struck me is people talk about a brain drain. I don't know if you've heard this, and it's striking to me because my parents talked about that leaving India. There was a brain drain of people who came to the United States. But you hear this in small towns. And I think that the elites in this country, some of us have been a little bit, or all of the governing institutions have been a little bit of, there's been a blind spot where we've been saying, okay, go move. I mean, how many folks have heard either political leaders or economists say, go move? Well, I tell my district all the time, how many folks in Palo Alto or Cupertino want to move? And very few hands go up. Right. And I think it's insulting to people in other parts of the country to say, go move. We shouldn't be asking them to move. We should be asking, how do we get the jobs and opportunities to them? And how do we create those economic conditions? And we can discuss a whole host of policies on that.
So a lot of the, Mayor, to you, a lot of the moments we were talking about were before you were born, most likely. Given that, though, what's your take on California as a blueprint or a political outlier?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much to ESP, the congressman, and particularly the folks who are working here today from ESP staff, but also the wait staff, the maintenance workers, the folks who put up the chains. And I start there because the conversation we had today is about all of us, but particularly around folks like them. The folks who drove us here in our Ubers and Lyfts, the folks that will clean up after us after we leave, and figuring out how do you make sure they participate in the greatest country on earth. And I say that because I think what's particularly interesting about California is not just the policies, but who are leading these policies. So when I think of, for example, Pete Wilson and anti-immigration rhetoric, that's where Kevin DeLeon, who's our Senate president, and Anthony Rendon, who's our current speaker, that's how they cut their teeth and organizing against that. When I think of some of the bold policies we're seeing being talked about in the state of California, they're oftentimes being introduced by people who are the children of migrant workers, people who grew up in poverty, people who remember their parents going to check cashing places. So I think the policies are important, but also the people proposing the policies. So in terms of California as a blueprint, I think it's not just enough to talk about sort of the policies, but how folks that we're not perfect yet, but our governing system is becoming more inclusive. So you have folks who grew up in poverty like I did, or folks who had single parents, et cetera, who are now at the policy-making table. I think it's one thing to argue a policy position based off a white paper or based off something you read, which is important, but I think there's a special urgency and audacity and a boldness when it comes from a lived experience, and then you can also read and talk about it. So if anything, I think California offers a blueprint in making sure our democratic systems are truly democratic, and that solutions are coming not just from thinking heads, but also from people who are living and dealing with these experiences each and every day.
So, Mayor, let's talk about some of the work you're doing in Stockton. So if California is a blueprint, then you're building on this addition over here. We've gotten to know each other through your historic pilot of a universal basic income or a guaranteed income, the first in the nation. So tell us about the pilot and why you launched it.
Yeah, so briefly, let me just talk about Stockton for like 10 seconds.
Please.
I see the clock. So Stockton is actually much more like other parts of America than when you think of California. Stockton's in the Central Valley. Incredibly diverse. It's a city of about 320,000 people. It's 35% Latino, 35% white, 20% Asian, and 10% African American. The oldest Sikh temple in the country is in North America. And at one point, we had more Filipino people in Stockton than any place in the world outside of the Philippines. The median household income is $45,000, very strong working class roots, and it's actually a 58-42 Dem Republican split. And I think that's important because the conversations we have in Stockton about economic inclusion, economic security aren't happening in a liberal bubble or silo. They're happening across party lines. Half of my council is Democrat, half of my council is Republican. It's really forced us to lean in some of these conversations and figure out how do we talk about a policy that's seen as liberal that's actually good for everyone in a way that everyone can get behind. So part of that, we realized in my first year in office that poverty was probably the crux of a lot of issues we're facing, not just in Stockton, but in this country. So I had a research team. I said, I need you to find the most radical interventions for poverty. Don't give me a program. Give me the craziest policy you can come back with. And they came back a week later with a basic income. I said, okay, well, so you just give people money, and that's going to solve all these issues we're facing. And I told him, I said, I remember Dr. King talked about this before he passed. I think it's an interesting conversation. I just got elected. I'm not about to lose re-election. My first 8 months in office talking about we're going to give people money and to see that just bounced back from declaring bankruptcy. But then serendipitously, I met Natalie Foster at a conference, and we were talking about the work ESP was doing and how they're looking for a city. And I said, well, in Stockton, we have a task force that's looking at how do we create a basic income in the city. And a match was made in heaven. So for the past year, we've been having conversations about the dignity of work, about opportunity, about this idea of the commons, about this idea of should people work as hard as they work and not have time with their kids and be sick and still can't pay bills? Is that the type of community you want to live in? And we piloted the basic income demonstration called SEED. So starting in February, 125 families are given $500 a month, and tomorrow they actually get their second disbursement. So Suki, I don't know where Suki is, but Suki is in the back here. She runs the program, so if you have questions afterwards, please talk to her. She has more answers than me. But it's been really interesting for Stockton to be ground zero for the conversations, because for our history, we've been ground zero for bankruptcy, for crime, for foreclosures, and now we're ground zero for lifting up, again, the stories of people who are working incredibly hard, sometimes working themselves to death, full with stress and anxiety and worry, and not working for yachts or not working for mansions, but working to pay for lights, working to pay for water, working to pay for medical bills. And it's really caused me to be more of an advocate and realize that I don't want to live in a society and I don't want to live in a community where folks don't have at least the basics taken care of because they are contributing and they are part of this common good.
Yeah. I hear you talk a lot about freedom and dignity that comes with economic security. And Congressman, I feel like that's also what's at the heart of your audacious vision for the tax code, the part of the tax code that puts money back into people's pockets, or the earned income tax credit. And you've recently reintroduced the cost of living refund. You've been a leader on radically thinking about how big we can go with the EITC for a while. Tell us why you championed this and if you've had any unexpected support.
Well, Natalie, first I want to thank the Economic Security Project and Chris Hughes and others who have been instrumental in shaping the legislation. I know you had Senator Brown here earlier. He has been a partner, and Representative Coleman. And the bill is very simple. We say people need to earn what they deserve. Here's the staggering statistic. Productivity in this country since 1980 has gone up at least threefold, and yet wages have stagnated. Wages have stagnated. So this isn't about charity. This is about the systematic stagnation of wages while the investor class and the shareholder class have been doing very, very well. There was a panel on the future of work at MIT, and the person at Walgreens or Walmart was bragging that now artificial intelligence allows their own workers to be so much more productive. And I was thinking, I wasn't on that panel, I think, great, but why aren't they getting the benefit of their productivity? What this is designed to do is to say, we are going to help solve that income stagnation. We're going to adjust for the market failures that have distorted the wages of folks and given people who are gaming the system economically more of the rewards in rent-seeking behavior, not in innovation behavior or entrepreneurship, and we're going to make sure that people who are working get paid more. And my view of it, and I've talked to folks at Silicon Valley, I said, you're going to go make your billions of dollars. You don't need members of Congress's help to do that. They're some of the smartest people in the world. I mean, they really are when you go talk to it. But why not make sure that the people who are working for you, as bus drivers, as security guards, as in their cafeterias, why not make sure that they feel a stake in this economy, that they don't resent it, that they feel some ownership over it? And that's really what this bill does. This bill says we're going to make sure that if you're making $30,000 or $40,000, you're going to get $8,000 on average back, and it's going to be monthly to help you meet the increased cost of housing and education and healthcare.
And there's a piece within it that I particularly like, which is expanding what we mean by work to include unpaid caregiving, work that's done at home to take care of an elder, a parent, a baby, or a disabled person, or a student, someone who's bettering, spending time bettering themselves for the future, but aren't traditionally counted as work. And so I think that's a really interesting policy idea to move forward.
Yeah, my wife, we have young kids at home, and my wife recently sent me an article. Can anyone guess what the average mother, and unfortunately we still have a gendered society, average mother spends, a new mom, how many hours a day they work? 14.5 hours. It's the equivalent of 2.5
I heard
jobs.
24.
So
all between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m.
This is some, an economic study. You can Google it, you'll find the article. It was recently out. And so obviously there are a lot of ways of work that frankly, the Republicans always talk about family values. How are you going to have family values if you don't value parents, particularly the first few years of life, where we know from Henkman's work at University of Chicago that by the age of 5 you can predict whether someone's going to go to college based on their vocabulary. That so much of the foundational development of someone happens at that young age. And so this bill takes that into account, that arguably one of the most important things you could be doing is being a parent to a young child.
Yeah. Thank you. So one more question on this, which is Governor Newsom recently announced $1 billion toward California's own cost of living refund, paying out monthly income supports to California's lowest income earners. And so interestingly here we have a city pilot, we have federal legislation, and then state legislation. And so how do you both see those three things working together at the national, the state, and the city level, just on this idea, but even more broadly? How are they reinforcing one another in this moment?
Well, while we have this president, we need the states and the cities to step up. I mean, what we can do at the federal level is put the blueprint so that when we do have a new president, candidly, that we will have legislation ready to go. And I believe historically that post-Trump we will see something similar to what we saw in 1895, where there was such a reaction to politics that it was the beginning of a progressive era. And I think we're going to see the beginning of a progressive era post the Trump presidency. And what we're doing at the federal level is having the blueprint so that when we have a new president, whoever it is in this talented field, that they will be ready to govern and will be ready to go from day one. In the meantime, I think a lot of those good ideas can come from states and cities, and to the extent that cities succeed and states succeed, it makes it much easier to make that case federally for the legislation.
Please. How do you see your work at the city level playing out on the national field?
I know, Natalie, you're fond of calling cities laboratories of democracy and testing.
That's not original.
So, I know, but I've heard you say it. And I think that's an important function. But I think the wider point I want to make is that no one solution in and of itself is going to create the dignity and opportunity that every single person in this country deserves. And it's going to take city, state, and federal legislation and policies to make things happen. Because as we've talked about, everything's so intersectional and nothing happens in a vacuum. Where we're talking about the needs for education and healthcare and housing and the need to make sure we have a planet in 10 years and things of that sort, that all those things require action from the federal, state, and local government. So we're going to get a new president, but I've been heartened by the past couple years, even despite the president, how cities and states in particular, the state and city I'm from, Stockton, California, have been leading the way and continuing to illustrate and fight and show that these values we hold as Americans, that if you work hard, you should be rewarded, that we care about everyone, that every human being has dignity, are things we've been able to fight for despite who the president is.
Yeah. All right, Congressman, I want to hear how your job has changed. So you've actually been taking bold stances since you took office, frankly surprising many of us who watched your race. And now there's this whole class in Congress, and it's the most diverse in history.
Wonderful.
And they are taking to Twitter and Instagram and C-SPAN with bold policy ideas. How has that made your job different over the past several years?
Well, first of all, they're extraordinary. They brought new energy, new excitement, new ideas. They make me look like the establishment pragmatist in the Congress. But I think that what gives me such hope is that the same country that elected Donald Trump has just elected the most diverse Congress in the history of this country. I personally believe that having ideas, whether they are divergent or challenging the status quo, having a marketplace of ideas leads to better thinking and better policy. And we have to be honest in this country. We failed on a number of fronts. We had a failed foreign policy, disaster after disaster, Iraq and Afghanistan, that let this country down. We had ignored communities after communities of deindustrialization where people felt that they lacked economic opportunity and they lacked the future and they weren't part of the nation. So we have to take responsibility for the conditions that led to the election of Donald Trump. And the same old isn't going to fix it. I mean, if Trump's election wasn't a wake-up call that the governing class had done something drastically wrong in this country that led us to this place, I don't know what is. And I think the freshman class comes with that perspective, that things aren't working, that we need radical change in the system. Now, that doesn't mean I agree with every one of their ideas. No person is perfect, but they come with that sensibility that I think will help us be much more creative in tackling the urgent problems of our time.
That's great. So, Mayor, I see you on Instagram fixing potholes and cutting ribbons, and at the same time, you have this national profile. You're going to give a TED Talk, you're pushing big, bold ideas. How are you navigating that personally?
As best I can. And I think even all the bold work comes from just being a Stocktonian true. So I understand my first responsibility is to do the best I can to represent my constituents. And sometimes that causes me to be in DC or in Sacramento speaking to folks at the more national level, but it's always with the idea of what's going to make life better or what's going to lift up the narrative of my best friends was joking with me because I posted on Instagram that a coffee shop and a 7-Eleven is coming to a particular part of my community. And he texted me, he said, "Mayor, you're excited about a 7-Eleven and a coffee shop?" And I said, it's not a big deal for you, but for this part of the community that was promised so many things 20 years ago and never came to fruition, it shows investment and that we care. So it's a huge deal. And even when I look back at my time as a council member, and I'm just as proud of the liquor store we shut down or the health clinic we opened or the financial credit union we brought into my old neighborhood as I am of the basic income trial, and so are the people in the city of Stockton. So I think, particularly around your point about government and folks feeling disenfranchised, it's oftentimes we think so big, but oftentimes the boldest thing we can do is starting really small and letting people know at the individual level your thing matters and your thing cares because you matter and you care. And I think when we do that, then we may be able to get more people rally around these big, bold ideas that can seem esoteric and divorced from kind of people's day-to-day reality sometimes.
So tell me about someone you're fighting for, Mayor Tubbs.
So you're going to have to stop me, so here we go. I'm fighting for, there's a young woman named Hazel who Facebook messaged me 2 hours ago. And she messaged me saying that, "Hey, Mayor, I have a voucher, and no landlords will accept my vouchers. So in the next couple months, we're going to have a nice policy fight about just cause evictions and non-discrimination ordinances on vouchers and inclusionary zone. It's going to be a fight, but it's for folks like her. I'm fighting for me 10 years ago, or 12, 15 years ago. 7th grader in Southside Stockton, hearing gunshots every night. An idea that I wanted to go to college, an idea that I wanted to be successful, but no real roadmap as to how to get there. I'm fighting for a woman named Miss Ortiz. Miss Ortiz is the most amazing person. I met her in 2012. I was knocking on her door. She came out, and we had this wonderful conversation for about 30 minutes. Her son was peeking out the window. He's like in 9th grade now, and he was younger then. I was like, why is he peeking? Is he okay? And she said, well, he never sees me talk to my neighbors because the crime in that community was so pervasive. And fast forward 3 years later, I saw her again at one big community rallies we had. So I thought she came because we had cleaned up her neighborhood. So I was feeling good about myself. I said, oh, Miss Ortiz, we fixed it, right? And she said, no, but I'm still showing up. And she still shows up to every meeting, pushing and advocating and understanding that we're doing all we can, but all the issues probably won't be fixed overnight. I'm fighting for the undocumented folks who live in my community, who contribute so much, the dreamers, who were just helping fill out their FAFSAs and their college scholarship applications. A month ago, who came to this country not knowing the language and somehow got A's and B's and are now trying to go to university and making sure they understand that Stockton's a place for them. I'm fighting for some of my trans young people who've been kicked out their homes, and we're trying to find homeless shelters for them. I'm fighting for the Uber and Lyft drivers from Stockton who do it in San Francisco and then they're come back and commute 3-4 hours and still can afford to pay rent. Yeah.
Congressman, I'd love to hear, what is your story? How did you decide to run, and who are you fighting for?
Well, that's tough to top. We need your voice in Congress, perhaps. For me, it's actually fairly simple. I'm fighting for the country, for the America I believe in. I grew up the son of immigrants, Indian American, of Hindu faith, in a county that was 99% white in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and right next to Philadelphia. It was born in 1976, our bicentennial year. And I had teachers who believed in me. I had Little League coaches who believed in me. I had neighbors who believed in me. I grew up taking trips to the Constitutional Convention Hall, actually believing in the ideals of our country, that this is a nation founded on a philosophical commitment to principles. And it pains me how divided we are. It pains me that this president appeals to our worst instincts as opposed to constructively thinking about what's going to create an inclusive nation. I fundamentally believe in the decency and exceptional quality of America. And I believe if we can solve some of this economic dislocation from communities that have been left out, that we can begin to stitch our country back together to the country that I remember growing up in as a kid.
So much of what we've talked about today, from antitrust to Medicare for all to a guaranteed income, has critics, right? Like, they're not here, but critics who say we can't pay for this. It'll never happen. We shouldn't get Americans' hopes up by talking about these big ideas. So how do you respond to critics in this moment? And how do you make the case for bold versus old?
With facts. No, I mean, let's just say if you wanted to, Bill Clinton left this country with budget surpluses. Is Gene Sperling still around? He was in the Clinton administration. He knows this, and he's got a great paper on the dignity of economic dignity of work. But you know, whatever else you think about President Clinton, and I don't agree with everything, but there are two things he did. He expanded the earned income tax credit, largely because of Gene, and he left this country with budget surpluses. And then three things happened. Three simple facts, which every Democrat should always point out. We spent about $5.9 trillion in wars we didn't need, in Iraq, and prolonged engagement in Afghanistan. We had about $1.45 trillion of a Bush tax cut that was geared to the very top. And then we just had $1.4 trillion of a Trump tax cut that was geared to the very top. Now you reverse all of that, and you have a lot of money to invest in expanding the earned income tax credit, child care, universal preschool, infrastructure, and you still probably have money left over. So we made some very deliberate choices under the Bush and Trump presidency that we need to point out were wrong for the future of this country. I mean, one point, it's just to show how short-sighted the administration is, because I always thought that the argument between Republicans and Democrats was over social equality and justice. I thought, okay, Democrats, I mean, we care a little bit more about, famous Mario Cuomo's speech in 1984 about the people who are disabled or don't have the right breaks in life and making sure that we give them economic security. And the Republicans are a little bit more Darwinian in what's going to succeed in the country. But I thought there was sort of a consensus that when it came to the country investing in things that were gonna make America lead the world, we were all on the same team. Reagan used to fund Sematech for the semiconductor industry. This president's budget cuts the National Science Foundation by $1 billion at a time where China is increasing funding on artificial intelligence. I was with Condoleezza Rice, who, one of the problems was the Iraq War, but she said, if you want to compete, double the National Science Foundation budget. So it's important for us to not cede the economic arguments to the Republicans. What their policies are driven by free market absolutism, because Paul Ryan and some of these folks read von Hayek. That's not the stuff. That's not the stuff that built America. We're a non-ideological country. We're a pragmatic country. We're a country that, yes, has free enterprise, but we're a country that has made systematic investments in infrastructure and universities and science and technology. And I think that the Democratic vision is one that's not only going to give more people economic opportunity, but it's the only thing that's going to allow us to compete in the 21st century with countries like China and others that are actually copying our playbook.
Great. And Mayor, the same question to you. What do you say to the critics who say this can't be done?
Well, it's TMI, but today as I was taking the shower, I was thinking about this idea of bold versus old. And what was fascinating to me was that a lot of the things we consider old now were bold when they were introduced. So I think about 100 years ago, the conversation about children shouldn't work, or that folks should have weekends off, or that people should have the right to unionize. That was like a bold idea. Mm-hmm. The idea that folks who worked their whole lives shouldn't be pensionless and poor was a bold idea. 300 years ago, the fact that I'm a human being and not someone's property was a very bold idea and really restructured the American economy. So in the same vein, I think what I love about this country is that we don't always get it right, but almost every century or so, we find a way to extend the social contract. Like when we finally know that we know better, we try to do better, and we have to iterate on that every year. So I think we have an amazing opportunity to continue that American tradition, in that we realize now, to the Congressman's point, that we spend money on things that aren't aligned with the values, at least the values that we read when we think about our founding documents, we think about how we speak about ourselves and how we look at ourselves as a country. So in terms of how we pay, and the other issue is, Natalie, is that we are paying for it. Mm-hmm. Like, poverty costs a lot of money. The amount of kids who don't go to school, we're missing on an ADA, the amount we spend on emergency services for homeless individuals, for example, the amount of we pay for children who have a bunch of trauma and average childhood experiences. Like we were paying a lot for poverty and anxiousness, and it's costing us trillions of dollars anyway. So I think we have to frame it as more of an investment. And that oftentimes, and I'm not rich, but I have some rich friends, and they tell me that sometimes they put a lot of money in the beginning, and it looks like they're losing. But then 10 years later, they're even richer than they were before. And I think that's kind of the frame. Is that how, I don't know, is that how it works? I don't have money like that, but that's how, I assume they're not lying to me. And I think that's why we have to frame the conversation, that it's not a transaction, it's an investment. It's an investment that'll pay dividends, an investment that over time is actually cost efficient, number one. But I think number two, we also have to frame it in terms of a moral cost. Like what does it say about us as a country? I think I heard today that Congo and another country had paid like family leave, and America didn't. And you could go throughout the list that's particularly women of color have worse conditions here than a lot of other places throughout the world. And I think that costs something as well. So I would say it's cheaper to be right than wrong. And as a country, we value things like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I think Gene's article laid out this argument around economic dignity for all beautifully, and he talks about how dignity is about agency, and it's about people not being a means to an end. That when we think about the economy, it's not what the goal we're trying to solve for is how do we allow people to enjoy life and use economics to do it. So I think if we frame the conversations in that way, then that question becomes like obsolete. Like how could you not pay for that? Like how could you not pay for our values? How could you not pay for a world where everyone would be better off, right? And all right, that's it.
No, I think that is perfect. Anyone else here?
I think I answered that.
All right, well, I just want to thank you both for fighting for the dignity and agency at the national level and at the city level, and thank you both for being bold thinkers. So thanks for being here, and thanks everyone.